This morning we pick up where we left off last week. And we're looking at how God is leading Moses to be the ultimate deliverer of his people out of captivity and out of slavery in Egypt. And we remember that last week we were having this burning bush experience, this burning bush Moses moment where Moses was talking to this bush that was burning but was not being burnt up, and God was speaking to Moses saying, this is what you're going to do, and this is how this is going to look, and this is what is going to happen. And Moses keeps saying, but if I go and if they don't listen to me. And so we pick up in chapter 4, and chapter 4 picks up in the middle of the conversation, and we're going to address that here in a moment. We pick up in chapter 4, and Moses answers to God, and he says, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. And the Lord said to Moses, what is that in your hand? And he said, a staff. And God said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he put out his hand and he caught it, and it became a staff in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Again the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. And he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. If they will not believe even these two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile, pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. But Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. Then the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. But he said, O my Lord, please send someone else. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is there not Aaron, your brother the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth, and I will be with you in your mouth and with his mouth, and he will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand this staff with you shall do the signs. When we return this morning to the unfolding story of Israel's deliverance from the hands of Egypt, we pick up where we left off last week. We come to the point where Moses is questioning whether or not the Hebrew people will listen, whether they will follow him. In his mind, he is still a fugitive, someone running from justice. He is the prince who murdered the taskmaster. In his mind, he is still a fugitive who is fleeing into the wilderness. He's been gone for at least the last 40 years. As we pick back up, we remember some context clues here as about the Bible. It is not written originally with the chapters and verse numbers. Those came along sometime quite after the original text. If we are getting specific, we remember these came along about the time of the Reformation when Martin Luther said the Bible should be distributed to all. It should be read by all. Everybody should have access to the Bible and the tongue that they speak. We should not be dependent on others to be speaking the Bible for us, but we should be reading and consuming the Bible in our language. So when the Bible was printed in the masses, they started putting chapters and verse numbers in. Because can you imagine us this morning when I said, hey, let's turn to the 1000th then in the Bible in Exodus? It'd be a little bit hard for us to start picking out then and start trying to figure out where we were talking about. So during the period of the Reformation, they started putting chapters and verse numbers so it'd be easier to study together. The importance of this note today is that chapter 4 is a continuation of chapter 3. There is no break in between the two. It was an unfolding story of God working to deliver his people through the deliverer Moses. So we remember in chapter 3, God called Moses. God calls to him in a place of desolation and sin. He was a murderer who fled justice. He was a murderer who stood when his eyes were opened and realized the injustice that was happening to his people. He took it upon himself to what he thought was a just action in an unjust way to kill the taskmaster. And he then confronted two of his Hebrew brothers and said, "Why are you arguing and quarreling?" And the Hebrews then stood and said, "Who are you but a murderer?" And so he fled into the wilderness. He is a nobody who went from being a somebody. As the prince, he is a nobody who fled out into the wilderness, into the land of Midian, who found a wife at the well when she was going to fetch water for her sheep. He is a nobody whom God chose to make a somebody, a shepherd whom God was going to use to deliver his people. We remember this morning that in the same way, we are likewise called by God, because in Exodus chapter 3, we find God calling to Moses from the bush, speaking to him in the burning bush. We do not seek God. Likewise, Moses was not seeking him. We do not go running after him, but rather God calls to us himself and delivers us from our slavery. In 1 Corinthians 1, Paul writes to the Corinthian church, and he is speaking to the whole church body, and he says, "Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise," Paul says to the church, "by human standards. Not many of you were influential. Not many of you were of noble birth." And he goes on to make this point. But he says, don't you see what he assumes? He assumes that every single person who is sitting in the church at Corinth was called, or they wouldn't be a Christian. Now this is a huge assumption, right? This changes our way of thinking. But let's put this in context of Exodus chapter 3. Moses had gone out into the wilderness. He goes on the western side of the wilderness, and then God speaks to him from this bush that's burning, but it's not being consumed. And we see that here Paul is reminding the church that you're not the most intellectual people. You're not from noble birth. And if it wasn't for God's sake, that you would not have sought God. And then he goes on to say in Romans chapter 3, verse 11, says, no one seeks for God. And he puts it bluntly, the Bible says that a search for the real God cannot originate in your heart. For if you are searching for the real and true God, the origin, the impetus, the impulse for the search does not come from inside of us. No one seeks for God. Why do we say that? Because in Romans 8:7, Paul says, the natural mind is at enmity towards God. It will not submit to the true God. It cannot, because we are at enmity towards God. The Bible says that the heart, the natural human heart, as Tim Keller puts it, the natural human heart, the goal of the heart in life is to get away from God. Its goal in life is to avoid the real God. So we can look at this and know from what Paul is writing here is that we would not seek God, nor would we find God if he were not first calling out to us, if it were not first bringing us to the place where he was. We must realize that the gods we desire, the gods our hearts are inclined to, are gods in which we control. Keller again puts it in this succinct way. Catch this. This is from a guy who is so much smarter than me. He says, human hearts are absolutely desperately afraid of one thing. Desperately afraid of one thing, losing control, losing our sovereignty. The only way we can avoid the true God is to fabricate a false God that's controllable. We're desperately afraid of one thing, and that's losing control and losing our sovereignty. The only way we can avoid the true God is to fabricate a false God that's controllable. And we sit here and you might say, Chad, that's a bit ridiculous. That's a bit of a stretch. Like, we can give up control. Okay, how often do you fight over the remote at your house? Okay, how often do you argue about how long you pop popcorn for in the microwave? Or how long it's supposed to wait after you hear the last popping happen before you open the door? How often do you fight over which lane of the road you're supposed to be in when you're going down the road? Well, this lane's faster than this lane. Or which way is the quickest way to go to the grocery store? And these are such menial things. And yet the God whom is calling us to love Him is asking for a complete surrender of all of our lives. And yet we can't even surrender the amount of time it takes to pop popcorn. You know what I'm saying? Or how long are the best type of coffee? Or such menial things we find in life. And yet the God who is calling us to worship Him is calling us to a complete surrender. We see here in what we've been studying so far in Exodus and what Paul has been pointing us to throughout his teachings of Jesus is that God is calling us not delivering for the sake of ourselves, but He's delivering us for the mission, delivering us for worship, delivering us to glorify Him above all else. If we are true believers this morning, if we have truly come to the point of knowing God, then we have all had a burning bush experience. We've had a moment when God has spoken to us and God has demonstrated to us that He is complete sovereign, that He is complete sustaining Himself outside of us. He doesn't need us to sustain Him. Whether it be at a church service or it be when you're singing in the shower, God has spoken to us and revealed Himself to us outside of us. He has shown us His glory and His power for the purpose of redeeming us, delivering us from our slavery to sin. And for believers this morning, we've all had that moment where God has called out to us and said, submit, worship, I am God. Often as Baptists, we call this our testimony. We call this that moment where we can tell the story of what God has done in our lives. And we often say, well, this is where we know where God has been working in our lives. And so this morning, when you think about that, what is your burning bush moment? What is that moment in which you've seen God at work, in which it wasn't about you, but it was when God was doing something, when God spoke and said, I am God, and by the way, you're not God anymore. Because think about this in the life of Moses here for a moment. In Exodus chapter 2 and in Exodus chapter 3, it says his eyes were open. He saw the oppression of his people. He rose up and decided to take action. But in that moment, he was taking action because he was in control. In Exodus chapter 3, God is rising up to say, hey, you're not the one in control, but I'm the one in control. In Exodus chapter 4, so far, we're reminded that Moses is still having a bit of a trouble here, saying that, okay, you're in control. I'm having to follow you and your will. Right? And we say, okay, how does this relate to us? Is this not the journey that all of us are on? When God speaks to us, God begins to direct us. We begin saying, are you sure? How will we know? Will people think we're lunatics? Probably. That's probably the general response that people will have to people who have had a burning bush experience. If you were to walk down the street, let's just say if you were to go down to CMU and say, hey, by the way, I had a burning bush experience with this guy called God, and they'd be like, a burning what? Now, there's plenty of bushes you probably want to burn, and you're probably going to have some type of experience, but okay, you aren't here with me this morning, but you're probably not going to have a burning bush experience and have God speak to you and transform your life. But we have to have those because why? Because in that moment we recognize that we are not God and He is, and He's transforming us. You know, there's one thing, and you've heard this if you've been here for any amount of time, there's one thing that's been prevalent throughout my whole life is I like to be the one who tests the rules. You know what I'm saying? Some of you have kids like this. I have a child like this. God blessed me with a child like this. I think He gave me 3 of them. You know what I'm saying? 1 wasn't enough, so 3 is the number, and we'll see how many more we get. But you know what I'm saying? I like to be the child who tested the rules. So I grew up, if you're new here or you just don't know, I grew up in the Deep South. And in the Deep South, people start getting baptized real young because it's like the thing you do. It's like God works and people get dunked early. And I was like, well, I'm not doing that. Like I was that kid, and all my friends were like, why aren't you getting dunked yet? I was like, well, the preacher up there keeps saying, well, if God's doing something in your life, you're supposed to have some type of life change. Y'all aren't changing. And I would say that. I was that jerk who would be like, ain't nothing changed in you. Like, what happened to you? Like, you're still the same kid. And so I would say that out loud. Like, that was who I was. It's kind of still who I am. And I would say those things, and so I wouldn't buy into the sauce. Like I was like, something's got to give here. If God is who God says He is, and who that guy standing up there says He is, when God does something in your life, something changes, right? That's what we see. That's what this guy up here keeps saying, that something's going to change. Well, all these people are getting dunked, and all they're doing is getting wet. Like something's got to give here. Like I'm not all about standing in front of people. I hate being in front of people. Like today, I don't do that. Like being in front of people is a problem. Like, and going up there to the way up there and getting put in a bathtub, like we got one of those at the house. Like why do we have to do that? Like it didn't work. And so there was a Tuesday night in a revival, and I was sitting way back over there on that side, and all of a sudden something started happening, and it was that moment for me. And it was 12 years old, and God spoke something to me. Now what did He speak? I don't know. I don't get it. But God showed me that night that whoever was standing up there, that He was God and I was not, and it didn't matter what I understood. You know what I'm saying? And we got to get to that point. We've got to get to that point. Fast forward, a couple weeks ago we had a friend here, and we briefly joked in the service about, some of the most meaningful moments me and Marty had together were in Central Park. That's where I was called in ministry, was in Central Park, New York. And it was in that moment, almost like a Moses moment, where we knew what God was telling us to do. And the same kind of thing was, the burning bush moment there was, no, 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 no. What if no? I was 21 going on 22, and God says, you're going to do this. And I go, nope. And Marty goes, yep. I'm like, who, what? It's a matter of who are we to say that we're still God. You with me on that? When we know and have that moment, it's a moment of trusting who God is and recognizing that we're not. That's why it's that important in this moment that we step back into Exodus 3 and say, if we're truly believers, if we truly know God, it doesn't matter which denomination we come from, it doesn't matter which church we grew up in, it doesn't matter what our religious background is. Religion doesn't matter. Religion is a man-made thing. Religion gets you closer to hell, not closer to God. A relationship gets you closer to God. We need a relationship. We don't need religion. We need to know God. And that's what God demonstrates this morning when He's talking and when He's diving into what's happening with Moses. He's demonstrating a relationship. This morning, if you're here and you're not a believer, ask the question, am I trying to dive into a religion, or am I trying to look at a relationship and buy into what God is speaking? Am I in this because I want to hear somebody give me a bill of sale that's going to make me feel better about myself? This is not about you having your best life now. This is about you understanding how God is wanting to radically change your life through a moment of Him bringing you into a relationship, not into some type of thing that you're going to buy into and give it all up for, but you're going to buy into, and He's going to take it and use it and deliver you to a mission and change your life because of it. Moses has been called, he's been delivered to the mission of bringing the Israelite people out of Egypt, bringing them to worship God. Here in the opening verses of chapter 4, we again see some of the same fears that we saw in chapter 3. Moses is worried that the people would not respond. In chapter 3, Moses goes so far to say that if I go to the people, who am I to say sent me? God says to Moses, His name, He says, I am sent you. I am Yahweh. I am Jehovah. I am the God of the past. I am the God of the present. I am the God of the future. I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of Isaac. I am the God of Jacob. I am the God of all generations that are to come. I am the God of the present. I am the God of the future. I am. God gives him His name. In Exodus 3:18, God directs Moses. He says, and they will listen to your voice. Okay, so that problem should be solved. He says, they're gonna listen. However, in Exodus chapter 4, verse 1, Moses again says, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice. He just said they're gonna listen. I mean, this is like a Mississippi kid here saying, okay, He just said they're going to listen. I mean, if you're a parent here, or maybe you were this kid, it's just like, you didn't listen to what I just told you. Right? Remember we talked about this last week. It's like when you tell your kid, or you were that kid, okay, you need to go cut the grass. But what happens if I cut the grass? Oh, you're going to cut the grass. You know what I'm saying? And now in Exodus chapter 4, verse 1, he goes back to saying, but again, and God goes, no. You're going to do this because I'm telling you, God has just said they will listen to your voice. The elders will go to the king of Egypt and say, let the people go to worship the Lord our God. Here at this point, we begin to see the pattern of doubt and worry. If I go to these people, they will not believe me. This is the point here where Moses must trust the sovereignty of God. This picture of Moses is drastically different than the one we saw in Exodus 2. The young man who had grown up, the young man whose eyes were opened, who saw the affliction of his people, who unjustly acted to deliver his people and ended up having to flee for his life. Here, 40 years later, God is directing Moses to go back and to be bold. This action-oriented, strong, well-trained prince is to go back and to be bold. And he's now making excuse after excuse after excuse of why he shouldn't go back and deliver his people. But God is not done. God has not called Moses from the bush just so that he could have a neat experience. God has called Moses from the bush so that Moses would know God, so the people of God would be delivered to worship God. God provides for Moses signs to show the people, perhaps signs to give Moses more confidence and to find the strength to demonstrate to Moses that God is God. In verse 2 of Exodus chapter 4, I know you didn't think I was going to get there, but in Exodus chapter 4, verse 2, the Lord said to him, what is in your hand? And he says, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses ran from it. Ideal response. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. This is not normal. I don't know, some of you may be city folk, so you don't deal with snakes very much. That ain't right. When I was little, we're telling a lot of stories today. When I was little, my parents decided that it was time for us to move out and have horses and learn responsibility. So we sold our house in town, and I think I was 4, maybe 5. And we went and bought this little 3-bedroom house out in the middle of a lot of land. And you know, when you sell a house, you get disclosures with the house. Well, I don't think we did that back then, but we're there, and this lady tells us, by the way, something that comes with this house is a massive snake. And she wasn't joking. Massive king snake. Now, when you live on a farm, king snakes are good. I don't know if y'all have king snakes up in these parts. King snakes are good. They eat cats and rats and other snakes and all that kind of stuff. It's a good day. You know what I'm saying? She said, it's a big snake. I was like, okay. I didn't like snakes. Still don't like snakes. One day we were out there, and so we're about 50 yards from the barn where the horses were. There's a gate, normal sized gate, I don't know, 8 foot, 10 foot long, wide gate. Something stretched out underneath that gate in the sun. I was like, well, what that is? It was that snake. Big snake. Dad said, go take care of the horse. They'll be all right. Later that summer, maybe a year or so had passed. I don't know. I don't want to exaggerate that one too much. Some time had passed, I'm sure. I don't think it was the same summer. I was out playing in the backyard. Now, don't take this illustration too far. I am from Mississippi, but we wear shoes down there. But I was out playing barefoot because it was summertime. It was hot in Mississippi. Like, it's hot down there. I was running through the backyard. I stepped on something. It was that snake. Let me just tell you. We had an experience. Me and Jesus the snake, we all had an experience. I still don't like snakes. So God tells Moses here, that snake's still there, I'm pretty sure. God tells Moses here, what's in your hand? Now, for a shepherd, this is a normal conversation. To have a staff, it's what you're supposed to have when you're out with the sheep. You have a staff, you have a stick. You're going to protect your sheep. You're going to pick up the sheep when they go astray. I mean, it's a normal thing. You have a stick, and God says, throw the thing on the ground. It became the snake. Moses ran. I mean, that's what I would have done. I'd have run. I told y'all my first summer in here. I don't run for anything. But you see a snake, I'm going to run. The Lord says to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. If you've been around snakes, you don't grab a snake by the tail. You just don't do that. That's dumb. You reach down and grab it by the back of the head. You grab it by the tail, you're going to get bit. That's what you're going to do. You don't do that. But what God is doing here, what God is demonstrating here, is God is providing is not just random. But we remember here that God is, and God's people have fallen under the control of the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, who has declared himself a god. And the symbol quite often placed on the crown or around their heads or on their clothes in the castle was two snakes, cobras, facing each other. And here what God is demonstrating to Pharaoh and to the Hebrew people is that he is God. He is God. And even the Pharaoh will submit to the will and to the control of God. And he has no control or power over the Lord. However, all deities, all gods will submit to the Lord. That is the promise we have in Genesis chapter 3. The head of the snake will be crushed. No other God can stand next to God. All will submit. And the promise is what we see here from Paul, reflects on what we learn here in Exodus chapter 4. Romans chapter 8, 31 to 39 says, what shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? When then shall we, he who did not spare his own son but gave him up for us, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Who shall bring any charge? Who shall bring a charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is it to condemn? Christ Jesus is the one who died. More than that, who was raised. Who is at the right hand of God? Who is indeed interceding for us? Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, damage, or danger, or the sword? As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. Knowing all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us, for I am sure that neither death nor life nor angels nor rulers nor things in the present, notice this, not death nor life nor angels nor rulers nor things present nor things to come nor powers nor height nor depth nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Paul says it very clearly. Nothing stands up to God. This is a shot across the bow. God is demonstrating to the world that he is God. Not only is he giving them his name, but he's showing them that he is the God of all deities, of all other gods. He is demonstrating that I am God and everything submits to him and to him alone. Get this, God was going to use this stick that Moses probably would have had with him almost all the time. He is a shepherd. God was going to use this stick to demonstrate his power, his glory, his authority to Moses, to the Hebrew people, and to the world, so that the world would know who God is all through this stick. He says, reach down and grab it by the tail. Why? Because I am God and I am in control. Trust me, and the world will know that even all other deities submit to me. God will use this stick to demonstrate his glory over all deities in Egypt. And we know that God uses this stick to what? He uses a stick to defeat Satan in the New Testament. These are not coincidences. These are promises. Put this down as a moment of deliverance that foreshadows the deliverance that is going to come in Christ Jesus, our King. This is a moment of us to foreshadow and look forward to the King coming. The second sign we see here, he says, put your hand inside your cloak. And he put his hand in his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. And then God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. In verse 7, he said, so he put his hand back in his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. And we say, why this? Why this moment? The snake, yes, the snake demonstrates the power of the king who has declared himself to God, and now we're seeing that even the king who declared himself God with the symbol of the snake even submits to him. But why the disease? Why this moment here? And God shows himself in his glory, demonstrating his power over sickness and in health. And he doesn't use a random disease or something that was completely out of the ordinary for the Egyptian people, but rather something that was completely wrecking the people, something that they were familiar with. God uses leprosy, a disease that required infected people to be secluded from the rest while they were sick, and cures were rare if there were any. God not only strikes Moses' hand down with leprosy, but he cures it. This is the God who we read about in Job, the God who gives, the God who takes away, the God who deserves our worship, the God in Ezekiel who calls us to worship in joy, the God who calls us to worship in our mourning, the God who calls us to worship in death, the God who demonstrates complete sovereignty over all of life, not just some of it, but over total sovereignty. We must remember that when God calls, that this is not just to give part of our lives to Him. We don't just give God our spiritual life. We don't just give God our religious life. We do not follow God to church on Sunday or Bible study during the week or by our choice of schools we send our kids to or perhaps our TV subscription. No, when God calls us to Him, He calls us to give us our whole lives to Him. He calls us to death. This is what we see in the picture of baptism, a call to complete death to any part of this life that we know. This is why we do not choose God on our own times. This is why our minds and our hearts are at enmity with God, because we would not choose to submit to a God who calls us to give Him all of us. Because on our own terms, we would choose a God that we can control, a God that would fit into our box, into our friend circle, into our lifestyle, into our neighborhood. Here God is demonstrating to Moses, He is demonstrating to us that He is God, that He is God who is in control over everything, over our sickness, over our pain, over our cancer, over our neighborhood, over what happens in our body, over what happens to our bodies by other people. He does not just come for part of us, He comes for all of us. He is in control of everything, even the things we do not understand, even over the things we cannot explain, even over what we do not know is happening. He says, I am God over all of that. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away, and Job says, blessed be the name of the Lord. That's the joy that we see happening here in Exodus chapter 4. But even in this moment, after these two great signs, I'll have to admit I probably would have not stayed around long after the first one. I'd be like, peace, I'm out. God provides a third sign for Moses and for the people. The Nile River, also a god, also to be worshipped by the Egyptians as a life giver. Now I'll admit, just like the burning bush came to life for me by living out here in the desert or in the valley, the Nile River brings new life to us. If you've never lived in a place like this before, I admit I came from Mississippi, there's water everywhere. You poke your hand in the ground and there's water. I mean, there's water. I mean, you come out here and all of a sudden you realize this is neat to read this in this context. The Nile River was important. Why? Because if the river ever wasn't there, there was no water. They didn't have the technology to drill down into the many aquifers that are in the region. They didn't have that or the tools to do that. And so the Nile was the source of life. And the people looked forward to the annual flood season. They actually were excited when the flood season happened because it meant more water would come. And so God says, and if they will not believe even these two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take some of the water from the Nile, you shall pour it on the dry ground, and the water you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. Their source of life, their source of hope for providing food turned to blood. The powerful God of the river was poisoned, ruined. Everything would lay in waste. But let us pause here for a moment and remember in Genesis what brought the Hebrew people to Egypt in the first place was a drought. Now it would be their source of water, the great river turning to blood. That was their source of freedom for the Hebrew people. God would take what brought the Hebrew people into Egypt and make it the curse so that it would be their source of freedom. And we question the sovereignty of God. Can we not look back to the end of Genesis and recognize that He was bringing the people into Egypt for a purpose, and yet He was going to use that very same source that He brought them in and use it to take them out? God provided for His people, and then the same source God had provided for the world. And He was not just God of His people, not just God of all of His people. God was demonstrating that He was drawing to Himself not just some, but He was demonstrating to the world He was God of all the deities, God of all creation, and creation exists for the will and pleasure of the Lord. Creation exists for the will and the pleasure of the Lord. Let us fast forward a little bit and be reminded of what happens in Acts chapter 5 with Ananias and Sapphira, where they go off and sell land and proceed to try to deceive the church on the amount of money they receive from the proceeds of the land. And in our mind, let's try to think of how we try to conjure up the amount of money or the amount of resources we need to survive. And let us go back to Exodus chapter 4 and be reminded that in this illustration, this picture is not something that's isolated to Exodus chapter 4. It's not just isolated to the people of God trying to flee the Egyptians. It's relatable to us in this moment that all of creation exists for the will and the pleasure of the Lord. Right now, in this moment, all of creation exists for the will and the pleasure of the Lord. God is not left wanting or desiring something. We do not need to come to the aid of God when we think He has left with less than or without. He has everything. He desires one thing from us: that we worship and bring glory to Him. If we truly study the Word of God, we will quickly realize that it is not a book of morals. It is not a good handbook on living, but rather this is a book in which God has given us to teach us about Himself. A book in which God has given us to demonstrate His love for us. A book in which God has demonstrated how He is delivering us with His power for His mission to worship Him. It is not a book of exhaustive answers, but rather a book teaching us to worship Him exhaustively. Verse 10, this is the good part. This is where you want to take a big stick to Moses. Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue." Then the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who has made him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." But he said, "O my Lord, please send someone else." Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is there not Aaron, your brother Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with you, your mouth, and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as him, be as God to him, and take in your hand this staff, you shall do the signs." Briefly this morning, as we examine this paragraph, Moses is again trying to demonstrate some type of reason why he perhaps is not the right one. Just as in chapter 3 he says, "If I come to the people," now he retorts to saying the same thing, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to me as your servant, but I am slow of speech and I am tongue." Perhaps you were this kid, or maybe you have this kid who just keeps coming up with excuse after excuse after excuse, and you respond depending on whether or not they like the response. The child comes back with another response, another excuse. We have just witnessed God provide for Moses phenomenal signs to demonstrate the people and for the world that God is God and the sovereignty of God will not be put into question. Now Moses comes back with another response, and perhaps he is not able to speak. We must remember that he is not the only prophet who has ever used words such as these. This is not something, well, perhaps Moses had a stutter, or perhaps Moses got tongue-tied, or perhaps Moses this, or perhaps Moses was just ugly. No, that's not what's happening here. Let's just be honest. That's not what's going on. If we look at parallels between Exodus chapter 4 and Saul's claim to be obscure in origin when he was in fact from a prominent family in 1 Samuel chapter 9:21. David's claim to be a nobody when in fact he was already a popular war hero in 1 Samuel chapter 18 verse 23. Hazael's claim to be no better than a dog when he was in fact already a major leader in Syria in 2 Kings 8:13. Solomon asserted that he was an only child when in fact he was probably at least 30 years old when he became king in 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 7. He said, I was a child. He's 30 years old. If only we could get away with that assertion today. And Paul's claimed to be the lowliest of the low among God's people in Ephesians chapter 3:8 and 1 Timothy 1:15, when in fact we know the life of Paul. He was anything but the lowliest of the low. He was an influential apostle. He was sent out to go and arrest the people of the way because he had power and authority. The closest parallel of all is Jeremiah's protest in Jeremiah 1:6, in which he claimed to be unable to talk, something he did a lot of for 41 years. All of these parallels point to the simple fact that Moses was not speaking literally here, but figuratively, responding to the great assignment with the proper sort of exaggerated humility and self-effacement expected in the culture. And God responds, who has made one's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? And take in your hand the staff, in verse 17, which you shall do these signs. Now, fathers in this room, is this not such a dad response? I made you the way that you are. Of course there is anger here. We can all relate. God says, I made you. I prepared you for this moment. I put you right here, right now, just for this. How do you think you got here? You are talking to a bush that's on fire. Examine the circumstances. I mean, it's almost comical, right? He's talking to a bush that's on fire, and God is like, look, what is the debate? If you want to examine your sanity here, you're talking to a bush. Go and do what I'm telling you to do, and do it the right way. Last story I'll tell you. I have this wonderful 5-year-old. She will often come to me and say, Dad, Ava Claire needs this, or Bethany needs this, and I'm sitting right there. Like, it's the three of us together. Like, we're all there. And she goes, hey, Dad, I think they... And I'm like, Annalie, we've been at this a few years. Are you still alive? Well, yeah. Well, I think we've done an all right job so far. Well, and then she'll start to question that. I'm like, well... The pastor's not perfect in parenting, in case you didn't know. My 5-year-old reminds me all the time, but this is that moment at which you're like, Moses, get about the business. Go do what I've told you to do. Not only does God send Moses on his way here, but notice the grace that he allows. He allows for Moses' brother Aaron to accompany him on the journey, which we know will lead to trouble when Moses goes on to Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments. What does Aaron do? He starts forming the calf for the people. What was the original plan? For Moses to go to the people, for Moses to lead the people. Aaron comes along by grace, but Aaron is not the original plan. God calls us. This is a huge thing for all of us. God has made us perfect. God has made all of us perfect with our imperfections. Those don't negate each other. God has made us perfect with all of our imperfections, with all of our blemishes, with all of our illnesses. All the things that we think are imperfect, they are perfect. They are perfect for how He wants us to serve Him, for how He has delivered us to the mission of making disciples and leading others to worship Him. God has made all of us perfect in our imperfections to be a part of the mission that He has called us to lead others to worship Him. Let that sink in. God has made us perfect in the way that He wants us to serve Him. It is no small picture here that these words from God are, go, get over yourself, I made you, take the stick, and go do what I told you. We fast forward to Jesus and we find our true deliverer. We find our King who took the stick, who did not have to be told to go, who did not make excuses, but rather when He prayed, He said to His Father, may your will be done, in Matthew chapter 26. And then He went out and freely offered His life for our salvation. He did not say, send someone else, for He knew that there was no one else. He and He alone can make the perfect atonement for our sins. This is our deliverance. This is our stick. This is how we are delivered from our slavery to our sin. We are all slaves this morning who need to be delivered from our slavery. This morning we come to the point where we have to either look at and realize that we have had a burning bush experience moment and God has called us His own and we have surrendered totally to Him, or perhaps we are hearing the gospel and God is speaking to us now. We are in one of these camps. There is no other. There is no middle ground here. Either we have had the burning bush experience and God is calling us to be obedient to His mission, or we have not had that experience this morning and perhaps God is speaking to you. Perhaps this is your moment. Whatever camp you're in this morning, know that it comes with total surrender. It comes with complete and total surrender. The question for all of us, and the reality is not all of us are believers. Not all of us have had that burning bush moment. I mean, let's just be honest. Some of you are like me saying, well, if God is at work in somebody's life, then they have to be a different creation. You've been watching church people all along, and you're like, yeah, ain't nothing changing in those people. Trust me, I was there. But the reality is what we see in people and what God is doing in people don't always line up. It doesn't mean that it's not real. It just means that we aren't seeing it. And don't let that hinder what God is doing in your life. Don't be like me. I'm not the perfect example here. Right? Don't let that stop what God is saying to you. You listen to your God and how God is speaking to you, because your God is our God who is the King of the universe. And we are called to worship and be on mission. That's what He is delivering us for. The question we ask ourselves, and an easier identifier for perhaps are we living for God or are we living for ourselves, is to what or for whom do we live this life? Do we live it to receive our accolades, or do we live it for our own ambition, or do we live it so that we can receive glory, or so that we can have a better job, or we can have more money, or we can have a more secure lifestyle, or we can have a better retirement, or a better house, or a happier, whatever we want to have a happier in? Or do we live it for the kingdom and the glory of God, to be a part of the mission? You say, well, Chad, if you only knew how bad I was at public speaking, or if you only knew how much I didn't like being around people. I hate being in front of large groups of people. But you know what? God doesn't care. You know what I'm saying? He doesn't care what I think about large groups of people. He cares about Him receiving all the glory for Himself. And He says, eventually you're going to get over your fear of public speaking. And you know what? It kind of happened. You know, if you have nothing bigger than yourself to live for, if you have nothing more significant than your safety, nothing more significant than your needs, nothing more significant in your life than comfort, here's the irony. If there's nothing bigger than that you're living for, if you don't have a mission in life, your life makes no impact. And in reality, that's probably the one thing you want it to have. Your life is making no difference, and in the end, because nothing is more important than you, your life isn't important. Because nothing is more important than you, there's nothing you will give your life for. Your life in the end isn't important. That's harsh, but it's true. Because if you're not living for something beyond yourself, it's not going to have a lasting impact. It's all going to end when you end. God says, however, if you know me, my cause, my truth, and my people are more important than your safety, your comfort, and your bank account, and your reputation. I want you to live for me, to live for your brothers and sisters. I want you to live for your neighbors, even if they don't know me. I want you to live for my glory, not for yourself. And in reality, we're going to be more fulfilled in that way. He came to live for us, to die for us. And we are fulfilled when we live for Him, when we glorify Him. And if we ask ourselves the true questions, the one thing we are looking for is purpose and meaning. And purpose and meaning comes when we know Him, when we love Him, when we exist for Him, not when we exist for ourselves. Because when we exist for ourselves, in the end, everything ends. When we exist for Him, it lasts forever. Think about that for a moment this morning. Think about all the excuses that we make. Think about everything God is wanting to do in and through us. This morning, God has demonstrated His glory through the life of Moses, just in these first 3.5 chapters. And what's so significant about these first 3.5 chapters of the book of Exodus is that they are extremely relevant to our lives in 2017. Extremely relevant to the fact that we are in need of deliverance. Extremely relevant to the fact that when God calls us to mission, we quite often have more excuses than even Moses had. Extremely relevant to the fact that when God is speaking to us, we're quite often the ones coming up with excuses or distractions or whatever else may be the case, and putting more things in our life so that we don't listen to the fact that God is at work. And He's saying, I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of Isaac. I am the God of the scoundrels like Jacob. I am the God who will be remembered for all generations. And let us just be reminded this morning that we are the ones who have been mobilized to the mission for all generations. It is part of who we are this morning. And when we come up with excuses, well, like, I have this illness, or I have this pain, or I have this, or I have that, or I have that, God says, I am the God of your illness. I am the God of your pain. I am the God of your job. I am the God of your neighborhood. I am the God of your friends. I am the God of your enemies. I am the God of all of those things. And they are not excuses, but they are opportunities for you to love me, for you to worship me, for you to be delivered even more. Even more. Let us see that this morning. Let us worship Him this morning. Let us glorify Him this morning in our weakness. God takes a nobody and makes him a somebody for His glory.